My love and I, beneath the weeping willow, but now alone I lie, and weep beside the tree.
You're listening to Haunted Moments, and I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Theresa F. Koch. In 1949, a school bus filled with children stalled as it tried to climb a small grade on the tracks of a railroad crossing located at the corners of Shane and Villamane roads, just off Southeast Loop 410. These were times when many rural crossings had no signals and were designed to accommodate trains, not vehicles. Wood placed between tracks on the crossing would often warp and create a trap for tires, and little thought was given to keeping the grade even on both sides of the crossing. Although details were sketchy, it seems the bus was able to get its front wheels over the tracks, but then stalled while trying to climb a sudden steep grade on the other side of the crossing. Meanwhile, the back wheels acted like an anchor stuck between pieces of wood and tracks so that the engine kept stalling as it tried to move the bus. With no warning, a train was seen coming down the track. Panic set in and escape seemed impossible. A few lucky children got out through the windows, but the driver and most of the children died. Between 1949 and 1951, area residents reported seeing ghostly kids. Several streets nearby the crossing bear the first names of children. It's been incorrectly assumed that the streets were named for either some of the crash victims or survivors. The names were already in place for years before this disaster, but the ghosts came after. Elderly man in his 80s claimed that he and his family lived in the area near the tracks for years. He was only 15 years old when the children were killed, but had sketchy memories of the incident. His father was one of the first on the scene after the bus was hit by the train, but never spoke much about what he had seen. The man's connection to the event came into play in 1951, just 2 years after the crash. His father had just started to work on the engine of an older vehicle the family used for local errands and some hauling. He stated he thinks it might have been a 1935 Dodge pickup. In what was a very hot summer, the engine kept overheating near the railroad crossing. Given the change in the grade, the rough crossing boards, and the age of the truck, no one thought there was anything unusual about that. But before his father could get very far with the repair job, a call came from an uncle who lived about 15 miles away. His uncle needed his father to make a local delivery of some farm machine parts he had sold. The father was paid for these runs, and the extra money came in very handy. The father and his 17-year-old son headed out in the old dusty pickup. When they got to the crossing, the pickup coughed and the gears were grinding, but the old truck made it over the tracks and just beyond before dying. Because they were now on an upgrade, his father put the truck in neutral and told the teen to keep his foot on the brake until he yelled for him to take it off. His father was going to try and push the pickup just off the road to see what could be done to get it started. While his father headed around the back of the pickup, he felt a sudden jolt. He wondered why his dad hadn't told him to let his foot off the brake. His father thought the engine was coming to life and headed back to the cab, jumping into the driver's seat. The son scooted over and both wondered what had happened. Over the next few seconds, they felt two more jolts and the pickup started rolling uphill. As the vehicle arrived at the top of the grade, his father tried to start the pickup. The engine groaned to life. They drove off somewhat puzzled, but focused on the errand at hand. After arriving at the uncle's house, he went around the back of the pickup to make room for the parts that were to be delivered and made a very unusual discovery. A number of very small handprints appeared on the rear gate and the sides of the vehicle. There were no young children in their household as far as they knew. Kids stayed out of their yard because they had a mean dog. The last kids to visit their property were relatives who had come there several years before the incident had occurred. It's impossible to say if this amazing local phenomenon had its origin in his story, but people still line up today to have their vehicles pushed up the grade by small unseen hands that leave tiny handprints on dirty cars and trucks. Some people even sprinkle the rear of their vehicles with baby powder to authenticate the tiny handprints. So-called orbs appear in nighttime photos over and near the tracks. Many believe orbs to be seen as the presence of ghosts. but more than orbs have been seen by people living near the tracks. A woman called Mary said she lived in a house on one of the streets with children's names when first married in 1950. They rented the house from a distant relative who had never mentioned anything about the bus incident or the children. While sweeping out the home on a comfortable spring day, Mary saw a young girl standing at her screen door. She guessed that the girl was about 8 or 9 years old. She opened the door and heard the child say that something bad had happened over at the railroad crossing. Before she could ask what happened, the child ran away and around the corner. Upset, she asked some neighbors about it. They told her to forget about the whole thing and seemed very unconcerned. Perhaps this was some prank that local kids played on newcomers. Less than a week later, she happened again. Mary was sitting out in the front of her house enjoying the fresh spring air when she saw the same little girl round the corner and come towards her. Standing not 3 feet away, the child said, "Hi, I'm Emily. Is my mommy home?" Mary asked where she lived. The little girl pointed to the home Mary and her husband were renting. Just as she was going to offer a response, the little girl said, "Please, ma'am, watch out for the railroad crossing." Then the child vanished before her very eyes. Once again Mary sought some advice from her neighbors. Most reigned ignorance, but a woman who lived just several houses down from her told Mary what she knew. She had also seen Emily, as had most of the neighbors. In each case, the child warned them to beware of the railroad crossing and did so in broad daylight. Mary was even more shocked when she found out that her landlord had a daughter named Emily that had been killed in this bus accident. You've been listening to Haunted Moments, and I am your host, Reverend Dr. Theresa Koch.
Away, by the tree that weeps with me, singing away, away, till my love